Hello, everyone. It is Philosophy for the People with Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgis. And today we're talking about, well, not really Sam Cedar and Tim Pool, but that's a good thing to have in the title anyway. We're talking about kind of consequentialism and what that means, and other ethical theories, and kind of what that means in relevance to voting in American presidential elections, which people who aren't me really like to talk about. So I think the show will be successful on that basis.
Fair enough.
Um,
Yeah.
okay.
So yeah, the essay is called Tim Pool, Sam Cedar, and Thanos. Is lesser evil voted like pushing people onto trolley tracks, and it was originally envisioned as covering much more territory than it did, but for once, Good Sense asserted itself as like, yeah, let's just cut it off here. And
Yeah,
uh,
I,
and
I'm, I'm reading this one. I was like, wow, I'm just done. Didn't
yeah,
take me
yeah,
that
yeah.
long.
There are 3,400 words. It's just over. It's like might as well be a haiku. Yeah. So, a lot of what it was originally going to cover is going to be in a separate essay next week because I was just going to kind of use this thing about this Sam Cedar Tim Pool thing as a framing device before getting into what I really wanted to talk about. But then the more I got into it, the more I realized there was sort of more to say about that initial Cedar Pool debate and this question about voting and the trolley problem and all of that stuff that I'd kind of realized when I started. I was like, why don't we just make that one this essay and the rest of that could be essentially a part two next week.
Someone seemingly genuinely was on the TIR comments for last week. Was saying that they were genuine. They were disappointed genuinely that Chomsky was not on because they were led to believe from the title that Chomsky would be appearing, which is certainly plausible and reasonable.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there have been a few of these with Marx's name in the title, and you know,
And we haven't got the issue board out.
yeah, exactly. He's not hopping out of our DeLorean to come on the stream.
So there's three problems presented in this essay, like thought experiments. I mean by problems. I think it'd be fun to start with
Yeah.
those. So there's the
Yep.
trolley problem, which everyone's probably familiar with, but I'll explain anyway.
Yep.
Which is when a train or a trolley is hurtling towards five people onto a track, it will inevitably and certainly kill those five people unless you pull the lever, in which case it will turn onto a different track and certainly and absolutely kill one person. I saw a fun variant of this recently for the very socially awkward, where you can switch the track and there's no one on the track. Nothing bad will happen. Apart from the fact that afterwards you'll have to go to like an award ceremony and people will like want to give you medals and shake your hand. And so that's a real dilemma for them. The second problem is the Fat Man on a Bridge, which as a philosophy problem is a great title. Where a similar sort of scenario, there's a trolley hurtling towards five people on a track. You are stood on a bridge in front of where something that could fall from this bridge and block this track, and you see that there's a very fat man ahead of you, and you have absolutely certain knowledge somehow that if you push the fat man onto the track, that will block the track, killing
Maybe
him.
you're a trolley engineer. Like part of what you do is like you spend your days, with like crash test dummies, like seeing how
I'm
much
like,
weight it
wow,
takes
he's
to stop the train.
perfect. And the third one is the Outback Doctor, where you are a doctor in a hospital, um, well, like a small medical clinic, and you have five people who need organ donations to live. You don't have the organs, not going to get them. Absolutely certain, blah, blah, blah. Just saying this so that people don't try and fiddle around with the examples, which is kind of really trying to miss the point. And a young kind of wanderer, loner kind of guy comes into the place and for some minor ailment, and you realize through examining him that if you murdered him, and stole the organs out of his body, you could save the 5 people. And so the common intuition is to say that we should switch the track, but we shouldn't push the fat man, and we shouldn't do the Outback Doctor thing. And this is reflected on the Phil Paper survey from 2020, which is a survey of analytic philosophers mostly, where massively, overwhelmingly, people said you should switch in the trolley problem, but you shouldn't. And this included a majority of consequentialists, obviously, a majority of deontologists, as in Kantians and those sort of people, and a majority of virtue ethicists. But for the fat man on the bridge, a much smaller group said that you should do it, something around 22%, which is around the same number as there are consequentialists.
Yeah.
Oh, and my intuition is, which is what I was building up towards, is uncommonly, slightly, it's obviously we should switch, and you shouldn't do the Outback Doctor thing. But I am inclined to think that maybe we should push that fat man. I'm not necessarily even out of pure consequentialism.
Okay, well, I definitely want to hear that, but they have I should say, just because it is like a pet peeve of mine, not unlike what we were talking about last week in the Chomsky discussion about the Turing test. It bothers me that like nobody who talks about this reads Turing. It does bug me a little bit that sort of due to the strange way that the trolley problem migrated from academic philosophy journals to pop culture, with stuff like the NBC show The Good Place, or like the I don't know, trolley memes on social media and all that stuff, that it sort of came with this name attached to the trolley problem. And so that's what everybody uses. But, you sort of very quickly realize when you hear a lot of people talking about that, and certainly Tim Pool in that debate with Sam Seder is one of these people, that they don't quite realize what the problem is supposed to be, right? That they have it's like what's the problem about
it's meant to be about the doctrine of double effect.
Well, sort of, yeah. So originally, so the original trolley example is from Philippa Foot, who has a paper called "Abortion and the Doctrine of Double Effect."
And she thought it was obvious you should switch, and that's how it was given, right?
Yeah, she thinks it's obvious you should switch, and it's like it's a paper. It's like a very strange paper, actually, in a lot of ways, because it's like. I think the argumentative structure of the paper is a little odd, but because she spends like a lot of it on what's ultimately sort of a very minor point for where she's going with it. But whatever, it's a very
philosopher moment.
Yeah, it's a very crowded paper, right? There are like there are like maybe literally like 100 different scenarios and examples in the paper, and one of them is this trolley thing. And her original example is about the like Edward is driving a trolley, and then like the brakes are out, but he can like steer it to the other track, and in later refinements there's like the bystander who can just like pull a lever, right, to switch it. That part doesn't necessarily matter, but and you're right, like she's taking it, like in fact the way that she's bringing it up is like as an example, it's like, well, this is obviously the right thing to do, right? So there's no problem yet at that point, right? That's the because certainly in my experience, anecdotally, and this goes along with the Phil Papers survey data, but it's like for non-specialists, is that if at the time when these days I live on a dirt road in Mexico. The only classes I'm teaching are online. But when I was teaching, I was teaching in-person classes at various places over the years. When I would sort of introduce this to students, especially back when I would do this before everybody had already heard of it, then I'd do I would do a like sort of introduce it with stick figures and stuff on the board, and then ask people to raise their hands if they thought that the right thing to do was switch. It's like everybody, like maybe one or two people in a class of 25 people wouldn't say switch. Like nearly everybody would say switch. And so I think if that was it, there's no problem there yet, right? The problem is introduced when you do these other examples you talked about, right? The sort of the revised Trolley case to fuck with our intuitions, and then the transplant case, which is sort of designed to be more extreme, so that even though, like, look, in my experience, if you do the revised Trolley case with the stick figures on the whiteboard, and then like people will start laughing nervously when like you get to the point, right? That's like, oh, you realize this guy's about the right weight, and then you ask them to raise their hand if they think that's the one's the right thing, and that's like, the numbers will like be reversed, right? Maybe like one or two people will raise their hands, but like nearly everybody will not. And then so Judith Jarvis Thompson, who's the person who introduces the phrase the trolley problem and the actual problem, right, is knowing that there will be the occasional Stefan out there who's willing to bite the bullet and have steely-eyed resolve even about the pushing the guy. She then introduces this third sort of even worse version about the transplant. And my favorite, by the way, response to the revised Trolley case is, I went to graduate school at the University of Miami in sunny South Florida. And I remember thinking that this was like the most Miami thing ever. There was once we just finished going over that. These two girls were leaving class, and I heard them talking to each other. I was like, I don't know. I mean, if he's that fat, like, how great is his life anyway?
I thought you were going to say it's a kind of like you have the Budrium's ass kind of problem of there's too many fat people to choose between to push up the bridge.
Yeah, not enough, too many fat people, not enough bridges. It's a big, yeah. So yeah, it's so what the trolley problem is supposed to be is the problem of this conflict of intuitions. That on the one hand, it seems right to yeah. Dasha was actually many moons ago in like 2021, like very early 2021 maybe, was actually a guest on an episode of GTAA.
All right, how was that?
Like I said, it was like early 2021, but it was but in retrospect, I've got to start asking all future guests now that I've seen some interesting recent quotes from her. For the record, are you worried about Jews and Freemasons infiltrating the Catholic Church? Get everybody on record on that early. But because, yeah, I think so yeah, what the problem is supposed to be is this. The problem is supposed to be this clash of intuitions. That it seems morally right to switch the track. It seems morally wrong to push the guy, or even if it doesn't, like, certainly by the time you get to carving up the organs, that seems wrong, even though on a certain level of description, at least in all three cases, the same thing is going on. That, in other words, that we have a choice between not intervening in a situation and thus passively letting 5 people die, or intervening in the situation in a way that we know will bring about the death of one person. So the reason it's a problem is that these things, sort of at first glance, at least, look incompatible. And, if you, and they're, basically the sort of shape of discussion about it is you can either, you can either say that, you can either try to come up with a morally relevant difference between the cases, right? Say, oh, actually, these aren't the same after all, because here's the important difference. Or
I just realized the background image is wrong.
What's that?
I realized the background image is wrong.
Oh, so it is. I totally did not notice that or think about it. There you go.
Thanos' ugly face in the top right.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so if so you could either say, here's the morally relevant difference. They seem like they're the same, but they're not the same. Or else you could say, you can bite the bullet in one direction or another. In other words, you could either say like, you could either throw out one of your initial reactions, say like, I guess on second thought, it was wrong to flip the switch, and we should just be like super Kantian about the whole thing and like not even do that, because knowingly, intentionally bringing about the death of an innocent person is categorically wrong, no matter what, no matter how, or you could say, I guess I was just being squeamish the first time, push that guy, and for that matter, transplant those organs. So like those are kind of your three options, and I like the way that you set it up at the beginning, because what that kind of points us towards is that there are two questions here that we should be careful not to sort of conflate, right? One is the sort of, is pure consequentialism, right? The view that the only sort of considerations that are morally important are ones that are, ultimately about consequences, good or bad outcomes of your action. Is that the right moral view? Which, sure, if you either say, yeah, you should be super content even about the first version, and you shouldn't pull the switch, right? Then obviously you've rejected consequentialism. But also, even if you think that there's some morally relevant difference between the two cases, presumably that moral difference is still going to be a non-consequentialist moral difference, that there's going to be something other than the consequences that's going to differentiate the cases, because the consequences are kind of the same. At least the most obvious ones are. So if you take either of those two positions, then this gives you a reason, we could sort of put it on the list, to reject pure consequentialism about ethics. But I think, going back to Tim Pool versus Sam Seder, 2019, that like the way that Tim Pool is setting all this up, right? He's saying like, oh, you're willing to do lesser evil voting, so you're willing to to do this bad thing, right? Vote for an evil candidate, less evil but still evil, and because of the consequences. So like that means you're a consequentialist, but like, what about the trolley problem, bro? Essentially. And I think that this is like really confused for a couple of reasons. One, which is where I sort of ultimately end up going after the part we're talking about, is you certainly don't have to be anything like a pure consequentialist to think that like its consequences are really important, and might even be the most important thing to think about when thinking about this kind of decision about elections and all that.
Right, I think that's an important point, because I think that's often something that people get confused about, which is to say that non-consequentialist theories aren't about ignoring consequences or trying to blind your eyes to consequences. Kant isn't saying like, if you think about stop, like a minute, like consequences, clear them from your mind. Rather, the discussion is about, are consequences the only relevant moral factor, which is consequentialism, or are they something you should think about?
There's like a joke I've seen on Twitter, philosophy Twitter, a few times about like, it's the deontology is when you ignore consequences, and the more you ignore them, the more deontology you are. That's genuinely and truly not it, right? They have even Kant, right? And I don't think like Kant ultimately has a very plausible overall moral theory, but I mean, like, even Kant is not saying like you should just somehow make your way through life without worrying about the consequences of your actions, because that would be a crazy view. Nobody thinks that. Nobody could think that. They have and he's not even saying that the consequences of various courses of action are like irrelevant to deciding, or even like morally relevant, right? They have because even when you're applying his moral principle, the categorical imperative, you're still, a lot of what you're doing is still thinking about which consequences you're bringing about, as you're, it's just that the sort of way you process them isn't like just add up all the good stuff and subtract all the bad stuff and you're done, right? It's like, well, is it right? Is it wrong to bring about this particular kind of consequence in this particular way? And certainly when you move beyond Kant to, what I would see as more plausible deontological views, um, you're like, I think it's very, you don't have to say, I guess basically what you just said, right? I mean, it's like you don't have to say that consequences aren't morally important to say that stuff other than consequences could be morally important.
Yeah. So to add on to the previous three scenarios, which you haven't
Yeah,
given the
yeah,
answer to yet, but
yeah.
it's yours is yes, no, no, right?
Yeah, mine is the boring standard answer: yes, no, no. You said yours is yes, yes, no.
Yeah. Well, yes, not sure, but probably no.
Okay,
Um,
yeah.
but the other two thought experiments. Oh, did you vote for Biden?
Is that a thought experiment? That just sounds like a factual
Oh,
question.
whatever. Next question. Did you vote for Biden?
Yeah, I lived in a swing state. I voted for Biden.
Did you vote for Clinton?
I am not quite. Oh, sorry, Clint. Sorry. You know what? I was going to say I wasn't old enough to do that. Then I realized that what it is that I'm so old that I thought you were talking about Bill Clinton.
No, I'm talking about the
No,
lady because I'm not sexist. She's Clinton to me.
there you go. I just did a sexism. Yeah. Yes. I did not vote for the lady. I actually voted for a different lady. I voted for Jill Stein in 2016.
Cool. Okay, so that's our five positions. But do you want to talk about this fat man?
Yeah. I mean, I think. I also think, God, in 2016, I think I was living at that point. I was living in New Jersey, so I might actually stand by that one. But anyway, they have a yeah. So right, okay. So my sort of initial intuitions, yeah, and we both did a racism because neither of us thought of George Clinton as a possible meaning of Clinton. But but yeah, I think so my positions in the first three are the boring ones that I have like exactly the intuitive reactions that like Judith Jarvis Thompson is counting on me having when she writes that paper.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's very lame. I just have the predictable responses. In And I say some stuff in the paper, which maybe we can get your paper, the Substack essay, which maybe we can get into about like what I think a plausible way of justifying why they're different might be, right? But to answer the rest of your question, I had in so my I think in 2016, my thinking about this was already starting to change, but also I wasn't living in a state where I had this tiniest bit of concern that Trump would win. And then 2020, I think I'd moved back to I think by the time the election happened, I moved back to Michigan during the pandemic. That because me and my ex-wife went back there for a while to they have because it sort of didn't seem worth paying for Atlanta rent during the when everything was online. And since Michigan was definitely a swing state, in fact, Michigan went for Trump in 2016. So I did, close my eyes and think of the National Labor Relations Board appointees and pulled the lever for Biden. Actually, I guess just like did whatever I did on my paper absentee ballot for him. But I will just say briefly on my position on that last set of questions. So in by 2016, maybe I would have voted for the Lady Clinton if I was living in like what I knew was a swing state. But like in 2012, like I also voted for Jill Stein in 2012, and I think I would have done that regardless of what state I was living in, because in 2012 I had a much more 2019 Tim Pool kind of position on the whole thing, and which in fact one of the things I said when I posted the Substack on Facebook is that friends of mine from grad school who could remember arguing about me this with me back then will recognize that to a certain extent I'm critiquing an earlier version of my own position here.
If anyone's wondering, I've never voted in my life.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, so in other words, we would have Prime Minister Corbyn right now, if not for you. Yeah,
I wasn't in
that's you.
Syria.
Yeah,
The 2017 election.
Fine. But yeah. So yeah, my like I used to be much more of a purist about this stuff. My current view is that it's like a sort of reasonable, like I think this is something that could reasonably be navigated in totally consequentialist ways, meaning like there are circumstances in which I'd definitely be in favor of the left trying a third party strategy, even if it increased the chance of the greater evil winning. I agree with something the late Michael Brooks, I remember, once said to me about this, which is that it's like, look, there could totally be circumstances where it'd be high risk, high reward, right? That you'd be like rolling the dice, and it's like maybe you could win. If you didn't win, maybe that would mean the greater evil would win, but it would still be like worth the gamble. And I'll still go with that. I just think, his point then and mine now would just be that these are very much not the current circumstances that the left finds itself in, that we don't have the capacity to do, a successful third party candidacy. And my assessment of the empirical facts on the ground would be that like running the kind of candidate who gets 2% of the vote doesn't really do anything. And so I think it's reasonable to vote defensively. That, in other words, to say not like, oh, I think that you can like push Biden to the left or whatever. I never actually thought that. I always thought like what you see is pretty much what you're going to get. In fact, maybe I was actually even too cynical about that in certain respects, although not cynical enough in others. I don't know, but whatever. Like I thought that I thought like I was basically expected Biden to be, actually to an even greater extent than the more complicated thing that has happened has been. I was expecting him to just be Obama 2.0 and, and not actually be pushed to the left in any way. But I thought it's like, well, you can still make a sort of defensive calculation that if, basically you're going to have to fight somebody for the next few years, you can choose the enemy you would rather be attacking you. I think if like an unusually considerate murderer gave you a choice between, attacking you with a gun or with a knife, I think it's like, I don't think it's like wrong to pick the knife. Obviously I don't want to be attacked with a knife, but if I think I have a better chance of surviving the knife attack than the gun attack, that's a reasonable thing to do. And similarly, I think
it is kind of funny with the whole murder at the door situation for canteens, which I do think in the end they don't really have a good answer to, that good of an answer to. But I think people do miss a lot of options you have in that scenario. Kant's not saying because you shouldn't lie to the axe murderer that you have to tell him the truth. You can perfectly tell him to fuck off, or you can go get your gun.
So this is sure. I mean, this is always like, I think that oftentimes with thought experiments, as you were kind of saying earlier with the trolley, I think it's sort of helpful to specify, right? Because this is something that a lot of people, I want to make some kind of move like this or like the classic thing is like, oh, maybe you could do like a carefully couched, evasion. It's like, I'm not certain where he is. Like it's possible that
answer like a philosopher.
yeah, exactly. And so I always, anybody who's seen the Tarantino film *Inglourious Bastards*, the farmhouse scene at the beginning of the movie. There's the French farmer during the Nazi occupation has this Jewish family who's like hiding under his floorboards while Hans Landau, the Nazi Jew hunter, is their SS colonel, and it's a really good scene, just as cinema, but also it's like really perfect for this, and I've often shown it in class because it's like I think it sort of really shows. It's like, well, look, you try doing some carefully couched, evasive, not exactly false thing, and since he's not an idiot, Landau will say, "Oh, obviously he's hiding something. Uh, shoot him, ransack the house, find them, right? Or maybe at best you get hauled off to be tortured until you say the exactly true thing, right?
Yeah.
If there's any chance of saving these people, it's by lying, creatively and convincingly and charismatically, which does seem like the right thing to do to me. But in any case, I think, which is why I'm not a Kantian. But in any case, I mean, on the voting thing, I think that I think it's reasonable. The thing that my sort of in my boringly predictable class reductionist sort of way, the thing that I would emphasize is preserving the tiny bit of institutional power that's been built up by the American working class, by not having like the most sort of hardcore union busters be appointed to the National Labor Relations Board and all that. So that's a very specific claim about American politics. We don't need to spend the philosophy stream adjudicating. But the point I want to make
Right.
about
So,
it,
so like, but you're voting for Biden, but why aren't we pushing Fat Man?
yeah, exactly, right. So there we go. Back to philosophy. So I have and I think that if somebody disagrees with me about the Biden 2020 claim and says that, like, I think there's like a reasonable way and an unreasonable way to disagree with that. I think the reasonable way is just to have a different assessment of the empirical facts on the ground than I do, right? To just like make different predictions about the likely consequences of the different decisions that you say, oh, actually, I think that long term it'll have better consequences if leftists don't just give up their votes so easily or whatever, right? Like that's the sort of line that people take. And I think if you think that, then we're not having a philosophical disagreement. We're just maybe we're just having a disagreement about which factual predictions are true. The more philosophically interesting question is it wrong not because I have some false premises about the consequences, but is it wrong on principle to do it? Is it like pushing the fat man? Is it like harvesting the organs of the healthy patient? And I think no, it's not. I think that that if you think about this is one of the reasons I wanted to emphasize what the actual problem is supposed to be with the trolley problem. That like it's plausible to me, and this is not clear to me that this is where Tim Pool was going with it. I should also say Tim Pool was like, when he did this debate, he was sort of nearing the final phase of his long transformation from being like an Occupy Wall Street guy in 2011 to just being like a Republican now.
I was a bit confused because I just know him as the right wing guy. So I was confused why he was like, no, we shouldn't vote for the lesser evil, when I would thought you just think one of them is good.
Yeah. Yes, he had a very long, strange evolution. So in 2019, when he was debating Sam Seder, he was still, I think in a lot of ways, he'd moved pretty considerably to the right on a lot of issues, but he was still sort of doing this like kind of, it's like he was still saying some of the same things that, like, I don't know, Glenn Greenwald was saying in 2012, for example, right? That you have that it's just kind of wrong to vote for any of these people, and the lesser evil is still evil. And so he was like, I guess in that debate, nominally, right, he was sort of criticizing Sam sort of from the left. It's not totally clear he would have agreed that Trump was the greater evil even then, right? But it's like, but sort of from this like at least performatively more radical position, more anti-establishment. But then by the time the 2020 election came around, he decided that actually it's fine to vote for the lesser evil, and that's Donald Trump. And these days, I'm not even sure he'd call him the lesser evil. I think he might just say it's like he's great, right? But but putting aside Tim's later evolution, and he's still saying fascinating things about philosophy. There's a recent one where he was like nodding while one of his guests said that Plato founded the Illuminati, and he said Bertrand Russell was like one of the main members of like the deep state, and that
The man that went to prison.
Yeah, literally. And Kant was like advocating a one world government, which is anyway, whatever. But they have a so he has a lot of views like this. But putting all that aside, and so if you think about that 2019 Tim Pool position, where I get off board is that it seems to me that thinking about the trolley problem, this is why I wanted to emphasize what the actual problem was supposed to be. That sure, there are plenty of ways in which you might be dooming somebody. Like it's not clear to me this is where Tim was going, but forget Tim for a second, right? Just in general, right? If somebody wanted to take this position, there are lots of ways in which you might be sending a train to kill somebody by voting for a mainstream candidate. That, you know, if like presidents make decisions to kill people all the time in all sorts of ways, certainly one of those, and yeah, I mean, like, you know, they do things like decide whether to sign off on particular drone strikes or cruise missile attacks or whatever. And even if part of your criteria for deciding who the lesser evil is that you're going to try to do the less warmongery of the candidates available to you, it could still totally be the case that there might be individual instances in which the less warmongery candidate might still kill somebody who the more warmongery candidate wouldn't, right? Because like they're two different people and there's no guarantee that like where they'll come down on every single individual decision that they're presented with is the same. So I think it's a realistic possibility that you might be sending the train down to the track at somebody by doing this. But it does seem to me that if you think about the nature of the action, right? This is what, if you're in any sense a deontologist, this is what you're concerned with, not just what the consequences are, but like what kind of action it is, right? If you think about the nature of the action, it seems to me that voting for somebody who might then do X, Y, or Z god awful thing that who knows who could die as a result, in order to stop the other person who you think is going to make do even worse things from taking office, that strikes me as much more similar to diverting a train onto a second track than it does to doing
The pushing.
to doing the pushing or
Pushing fatty.
Yeah, pushing fatty, or certainly harvesting. I don't know what we're calling him. Healthy, pushing fatty or harvesting healthy. They have a what's that?
Drifter.
Okay, yeah. They have a harvesting drifter's organs. They have and I think there's like at least a somewhat plausible philosophical story that you could tell. I'm not ultimately sure if this is the right move or not, because there is like a large and complicated literature on this, and I there's a degree of confidence that I'm not willing to exceed about exactly what the right what the right position is on all of it. But I think there's at least a somewhat plausible story you could tell about why these are moral, like why it's okay to divert the trade and it's not okay to push the guy or harvest the organs.
Because in the case of the fat man, you're willing towards death.
Yeah, exactly. Like they have so one thing I think, if you start to think about the morally relevant differences that there might be between these cases, I think one pretty clear difference comes out when you think about ways in which things could fail to play out the way that you think they will. They have so obviously in our discussion of it so far, we've said, okay, you're just sure this is going to happen. You're sure that's going to happen. Fair enough, right? I mean, that definitely brings out what people oftentimes don't understand the point of that, by the way. I should just say like maybe just 10 seconds about this part. That's like, it's like, oh, why are you interested in like contriving the details of these thought experiments in such like ultra specific ways, and like realistically would you be sure, whatever? It's like, no, you wouldn't be. That's not the point, right? It's think of it like a word problem in like a math or physics class, where you're having like the point The point is to isolate just the factors you want to look at, right? So it's like, yeah, we're artificially specified this, so just the things that we want to look at come into conflict with each other. We can actually realize what, that can help us figure out
A
more
spherical
specific.
cow is rolling down a track.
Yeah. So yeah. So exactly. So I think that, but I think we also can maybe see something about what you're talking about, like what you're really directly in the two cases. If you think about ways in which things, like, let's say you do the thing and then it doesn't turn out the way that you thought it would. They have in the case of the guy you're pushing onto the track, if you push him and then he's not actually run over by the trolley, like maybe, somehow he just, I don't know, they have he's like, he bounces off the track and rolls off and like he's a little bruised, but like he's not
He's
dead.
immune to trains.
He's immune to, yes. They have like, whatever, like you have or you just accidentally push him, like you get the angle slightly wrong, you push him onto somewhere where it's like, he's just taken a nasty fall, he's probably gonna have to go to the hospital, but he hasn't been run over by a train. Then his survival has just ruined your plan, because your method for saving those 5 people relied on his sacrifice. So so your attitude towards him is that you're using him in order to bring about that end. And if he hasn't played his role, then like your plan can't succeed. And similarly, I don't know, if you like conk the guy over the head and then and while you're still prepping the surgery tools, he like wakes up and sneaks out, right? Then like his good fortune is your bad fortune. He's just ruined your plan for saving those 5 people who all need organ transplants. Whereas if you send the train down the track, yeah, you're doing this knowing that knowing that it's going to bring about this person's death, but like,
Would it be nice if it didn't?
it sure would be nice if it didn't. Like if it turns out you were wrong and he actually did have a chance to get off the track in time, then yay, right? I mean, there's no, like, he hasn't ruined your plan, because your plan didn't involve using him as a human sacrifice. It was that, you knew that there was this horrible, you knew there was going to be this horrible side effect of what you were doing. But there's a version of this, which is Doctor Double Effective, which was the original, Philippa Foot thing. But I mean, like, there's also a way of putting it that I think is a very, I think has some plausibility to it, and I think helps like really capture the intuition for me. Yeah, that's right. Everybody should be like that at that Homer Simpson in that episode where he gets really, really fat, so they'll let him work from home. That's just in case your sacrifice is needed. But yeah, they have a way that I think really brings out the intuition is to think of it. And Judith Jarvis Thompson kind of floats this in one paper. She doesn't really seem to be satisfied with it, but I always thought, it's like, yeah, there might be something more to this, right? That like, even as you're sort of floating, that'd be like, probably not though, right? It's like this might actually be the right move. Where you say, well, maybe there's a Kantian distinction here, right? So we've already talked a little bit about Kant. Kant thinks that there's just one moral rule. There's a single moral principle, the categorical. Yeah, that's right. The categorical imperative, from which all of the other moral rules follow. But Kant thinks there can't be conflicts between principles because there's just the one principle. It's the categorical imperative, and there are a few different formulations of it. And Kant thinks these are all ultimately equivalent, right? It's like, no, don't worry, these aren't different moral rules now. These are all still one.
Which seems very strange. Like, they seem like different rules. Oh, they're all quite good rules, but they seem quite
yeah, they do seem
different.
They do seem different. There's an interesting question there about what he even meant when he said they're the same. If all that means is that it's just he thought that they would lead to all the same results. Also unclear, but they have a but Kant at least thinks they're the same. When I've gone over it in introductory classes, I'll spend 15 minutes trying to convince people that maybe they are the same, but just to kind of give Kant, his due, right? But it's also yeah, at the end of the day, maybe not, right? These are very different, but in any case, there are a few different formulations, but the formulation that Thompson has in mind is the formula of humanity is dead. So formula of humanity. So formula of humanity says should always treat humanity, whether your own person or that of another, as an end in itself, and never merely as a means to an end. Which, by the way, one fun parenthetical thing to say of interest to people who are going to watch this is if you ever see somebody who's been brainwashed by the Ayn Rand cult telling you that all moral philosophy before Ayn Rand, or maybe in between Aristotle and Ayn Rand, is purely about self-sacrifice and doesn't say anything about duties to yourself or whatever. Now that you've just heard that formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, you have another reason that Rand is full of shit, because whether in your own person or that of another, right? This applies to you just like it applies to other people. And utilitarians obviously think that you should, your own happiness counts. Anyway, whatever. But in any case, so this formulation of categorical imperative says people misinterpret it oftentimes because they're missing the word merely, right? They say, right. Oh, so you're saying you should never treat people as means to an end? Well, that's insane, right?
How can I go to the bank?
Yeah. Usually if I'm in I tend to get coffee on my way to class. So if I'm doing this in a classroom, I'll have a cup of coffee I could hold up and be all right, so when I was buying this, I was not actually interacted, with the cashier at, Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts, wherever I got it, we didn't have a deep, meaningful human connection. They have those
how often do you even treat anyone as a pure end is an in of themselves? Maybe when you're very deeply in love or something.
Yeah, right. It's but yes, I feel yes, I was using this person as a means to the end of getting coffee. They were using me as a means to the end of getting paid. I'm, by the way, also using all of you right now as a means to the end of getting paid. You're all using me as means to an end of at least getting some course credits, and maybe if you have really good intentions learning philosophy, and that's all fine, right? Kant's not saying that you're violating the moral law if you ask your buddy for a ride to the airport. It's totally fine to use people as means to an end. In fact, the only way to not use people as means to an end is if you went out into the woods and lived in a shack that you made for yourself and, ate only the animals that you killed yourself. Even then, it would probably be very difficult, not to use other people a little bit because we're social animals. But but that's all fine, right? The prohibition is against using people merely as a means to an end. And, the sort of the way I'd often do that is you think about if I got in the coffee from a coffee vending machine, and or I don't know, maybe the coffee is not a good example then, but if I've gotten if making a bottle of water, right? So it comes out of the vending machine, and it does that thing that vending machines do sometimes, where the bottle of water comes partway out and then gets stuck. Well, you might say, you might curse under your breath, or maybe more than under your breath, if you're alone. You might even kind of bang the machine to try to dislodge it. But if you were buying the same bottle of water at a convenience store, no matter how much trouble the cashier was having with your order, you would like curse at them or like hit them, because you correctly understand that the vending machine really is just merely a means to an end of getting you the product, whereas the cashier is a person. And certainly the ultimate instance of treating somebody as merely a means to an end is if like you're literally using them as just like a human paperweight to stop a trolley in its tracks, or like you're using them, or you're like using them for their organs, so you can transplant those into somebody else's body.
Right. I mean, just to be clear on which
Yeah.
you asked about an hour ago, what my kind of not entirely consequentialist
Uh,
notion about why it might be all right to push the large man, um, is that this kind of thing that I described, this will towards death, willing towards someone's death,
uh,
um, is not something which is easy. And I think that's kind of something that's missed, as if kind of killing someone else is a trivial matter, as opposed to kind of a great struggle for nearly everyone in nearly every circumstance. Um, and so I'm inclined to think, quite possibly, that the person who's capable of pushing the fat man off the bridge to save five others is a virtuous person, because they have this unusual capacity to will towards death for the sake of others, which is something which nearly everyone lacks, but seems to me, at least on the face of it, to be something which you would want, at least in a certain segment of the population.
yeah, I mean that's interesting. I think that like so if you think about um, virtue, sort of standard virtue ethics read on this, right? So I should say, by the way, I think probably a lot of people who are interested enough in this stuff to watch this probably already know all this, but just like very briefly. Um, so, um, consequentialism, you're worried about the consequences, you sort of, you think that like the moral evaluation comes in at the consequences of the action. Uh, Deontology, you're factoring in at least the sort of moral nature of the action itself, as opposed to just the consequences. And virtue theory, uh, you're not thinking, you think that the sort of most fundamental kind of location of proper moral evaluation doesn't really come at either the action itself or the consequences that brings about downstream, but comes upstream of the action itself at the character traits, motivations, that led you to act that way in the first place, right? A virtue is just a positive character trait. A vice in the original sense is just a negative one. So, like, compassion is a positive character trait, but greed is a negative one. And which I should say, like, even though it gets like short shrift in a lot of these discussions, there's something that's like very, I think there's certain kinds of moral questions it's not going to be very informative about, right? And I make a fairly sharp distinction between sort of the realm of like virtue and the realm of like justice, right? Society, right? But they have but there is something that's very right, at least in some contexts, about virtue ethics. Like,
I mean,
if you feel,
it came first in the Phil Paper survey, so
yeah, there you go.
despite being, yeah, as you say, regarded often as kind of like the little brother.
Yeah, yeah, and also came first in the history of philosophy, right? So, you know,
Enduring, yes.
yeah. So,
While
and
consequentialism was
there's
made up
something.
by English sickos in the past couple hundred years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, English and German sickos. Yeah, yeah, the original Greeks, who everybody knows didn't ever did anything wrong, had a virtue ethicist. But yeah, I think. I think certainly just introspectively, there's something very right about it, because, like, at least if you're like me, certainly if you think about like moral guilt, if you feel guilty about something you've done, you probably aren't thinking, oh no, I broke a moral rule, or even, oh no, I led to an overall worse balance of, negative consequences than positive ones, right? And I realize I'm loading the dice a little bit how I'm setting this up, but still, right? You think like, oh God, why did I have to be such a selfish asshole about that? Right? Like I think that would be the much more common form of moral recrimination, and that's putting the located it where the virtue ethicist wants to locate it. So there's definitely something right about it. I mean, as
Yeah,
far as
you say like kind of that the problem that people bring out about virtue ethics is that it doesn't necessarily give you a guide of how to deal with particular actions, but consequentialism and deontology don't give you a guide on kind of how to be the sort of person who will do the right thing without having to think about it.
yeah, so the question, I guess, is on the intersection between virtue ethics and the trolley problem is a question about what we think of as as like the sort of relevantly virtuous trait, right? Like in other words, is it sort of the
Yeah, is it brave? Is it rash?
yeah, is it yeah? So in other words, do we want people who are is the thing that we're thinking of as being really virtuous here that like you're so sort of is your willingness to do the steely-eyed thing and pull the trigger for the greater good, or is what we're thinking of as virtuous here that you just have too much empathy to be willing to push somebody onto a train track, right? And this is down. I mean, I guess this is what you were just saying, right? I mean, this is like the sort of flip side of what seems very right about virtue ethics, which is that the thing that often seems really frustrating about it, although I should say, I think even if you're not exactly a virtue ethicist, I'm not sure this is an escapable thing in any case, but it's like that it's often is very frustrated and not giving you better guidance, right? It's like what do you what should you do? I don't know, whatever the virtuous person would do. Okay, well, let's show me one of them, and then there's kind of a question of how to decide, who counts as a virtuous person without sort of deciding, what we think, how we think you should act, and there's a question about how informative this is and all that stuff. I should, I think that like, yeah, I mean, I should say, I don't know how far I would press that criticism, because I think that the idea that you could have like really clean cut guidance across the board is probably misguided in any case. I think that I think morality is probably just too complicated for that. They have so this is something I kind of raised very briefly in this essay that probably deserves an essay of its own in the near future.
Right, yeah. Like how can we know what the consequences of electing US presidents are?
Well, so there's that, right? So I mean, we could just be like, this is an objection. So there's like a general worry about not only pure consequentialism, but any sort of consequence based reasoning, which is well, hell, I mean, there's always indirect consequences. There's what if we I don't know, what if we I mean, hell, we could elect Bernie Sanders and somehow butterfly effect our way to the Terminator Judgment Day. I have no idea, right? But
Yeah, he'd fund education too good, and the AI would come on too fast.
there you go. Yep. Uh, so yeah, I would point out with regards to that when we're not thinking about morality, when we're just thinking about day-to-day prudential decision making, it's like trying to figure out how should I act just to sort of in my own interests. Obviously, a lot of that is consequence based, and we're not paralyzed by the possibility of unpredictable consequences there, right? Like we all sort of know how to function in the world in a way that's based on our best guesses about consequences, and we, obviously,
Yeah, and
you
I
know,
think the other major defense of consequentialism here is that kind of consequences disappear rapidly into the future. So
uh-huh.
people will give the example of like, you do something very minor and that makes Hitler Hitler, right? But it's not ever, that's like this kind of solipsism almost, right? Because no particular event 10 years or before whenever Hitler Hitlered, can lead directly to that happening. Well, it can. But at the same time, 10,000, 100,000, a million other events also will occur by
Right.
other people who engage in other willed actions. So you can't say, like, there's no way you can draw a line and say, this caused this 10 years down the
Yeah,
line.
you change only this, and this is, yeah.
Well, I mean, you can, but you have to divide it by like a million or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is an interesting thing here. So I should say, friend Neil Sinababu, who is a hardcore consequentialist, but he has a lecture you can see online. I think it's like a TEDx talk where he says, uh, where he introduces this interesting view where he says that it's like, okay, you could be a pure utilitarian about morality, but think intentions matter for moral responsibility. Where his idea is like, you know, you're sort of at fault for the rationally predictable, consequences of your action. Um, and so he has like this pair of examples that's like somebody goes to a distant country to, I don't know, help like distribute malaria nets or something, and unbeknownst to them, and there's no way they could have known this. They're carrying some like super unusual disease that ends up ravaging
Right.
people. And then on the other hand, you have some cannibals in like late imperial Germany who go around just like killing people and eating them at random. And it turns out that like some of the people they would have been were very young Hitler, Goring, and Goebbels.
Yeah.
And like this has had really positive effects on the world. It seems implausible to say that that like the cannibals are praiseworthy and
Right. Because consequentialism also generally talks about judging actions based on expected, not actual consequences. So that black swan events don't just throw everything out of whack.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, my own view is probably something like, and I mean, the virtue ethics question is interesting, and I also think that it's like, I also think that we're, by the nature of what I'm talking about, because what I'm doing in the essay is I'm looking at, at Tim Pool's use of the trolley problem test, this voting question, and all that, right? So it's like, by the nature of that, we are mixing and matching, I think maybe importantly different domains, between sort of, I mean, I do think that there's like a really important difference between interpersonal morality and kind of the political pursuit of justice. That they have a not that like there are going to be no points of connection between the two, but like that I think we just shouldn't be too quick to sort of merge those into one big thing. But they have a but since I don't really pursue any of those distinctions in the essay, I'll also maybe run roughshod over them now and just say, like, I think that the roughly speaking, the sort of I mean, my own position is, look, I think I think that like real serious 1.0 kind of Kantianism is implausible. You should totally lie to the murder at the door. And I think obviously consequentialist considerations are morally important, but also obviously you shouldn't like you should not in fact carve up the organs of the healthy patient, and you shouldn't even do that if we've like specified the circumstances well enough that none of the consequentialist dodges work, right? That it's like you're
Right, I
you're
mean,
only
for the Outback doctor, I think he shouldn't do it because he's a doctor. And that's not because of the consequences of like having doctors which do that, but because you're a doctor, you shouldn't kill your patients.
yeah, that seems like a good rule. So yeah, I think that there are, and
But you know, if you change the situation, the scenario, so that it's not the doctor killing them, but it's me and me Drifter One talking to Drifter Two,
and
and
you just do it as a favor to the doctor, but he didn't know ahead of time. Yeah,
yeah, and I'm like Drifter Two, are you signed up as an organ donor? And then you stab him in the neck. That I mean, I don't think that's probably not right, but it's certainly not unambiguously. I think there's a question to be asked there.
yeah. Okay. For the record, I also don't think people should do that. But that's. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think that some kind of pluralism is a sort of boringly correct answer here. That they have a that you that like so and I think like something that like Rawls says in the theory of justice is that if we don't have like a hard and fast scheme for like which way how to navigate trade-offs between values, that this is with our lexical ordering scheme where this one is always more important than that one and all that stuff. Then like Rawls basically says, oh well, if we don't have that, then we'll have like chaos and cats and dogs living together and all that. And I kind of I'm not sold on that. I think that that might be I think messy trade-offs might in fact be our fate, and that it's not actually as miserable a fate as all of that. But
Yeah,
that might be a
I mean,
good.
I'm always suspicious of pluralism because it is like it feels like a multiplication of entities. You know,
Okay, all
like
right,
it's
yeah,
like
yeah,
what?
yeah,
Okay, yeah, plausibly, yeah. It seems like maybe we should have some rules, but also we should have some consequences, and also we should have some virtues or whatever. But it's like, well, why? What do these things connect to? Like meta ethically, like what's going on here? I mean, it's just we're just being constructivists in the sense of being like, well, people think they are. I'm just like, I just don't find it very well. I don't find sorry. I shouldn't say don't find that very satisfying. I don't find that satisfying at all.
yeah. No, I get the frustration. That's definitely worth. It's definitely worth doing a future essay on as the sort of like is Rawls right about this, right? Because the ultimate, I think the ultimate question here, because I think a very fair worry about pluralism is not, well, necessarily multiplied entities. I think whether the multiplied entities worry comes up or not, I think is going to depend on like some higher order things about what you said about metaethics, right? I mean, like, are we like discovering moral facts of a certain kind? So there's sort of like ontological simplicity is actually going to come up there, or are we, trying to, systematize moral judgments in such a way that like, sure, you could have principles that are supported by a bunch of judgments that could then be used to discard other judgments. But as J. Cohen says, the judgments themselves still retain a certain sovereignty, right? Or what do we do it, right? So that's like a big, interesting philosophical question itself. So that's one word to have about pluralism. Another word to have about pluralism is like it just seems like a cop out, right? Like
Yeah,
it just seems too easy, right? I mean, it's like no, damn it, go back and try harder to make this more systematic than that. And that's all,
and it's also like, well, what if we haven't discovered some of them?
sure.
Like, is this ad hoc? Like, will there be more in future? Like, because obviously in the past, if you tried to do pluralism 1,000 years ago, when consequentialism wasn't really fully formed,
Yeah,
then like, would that be a different pluralism? Like,
sure, yeah. So I think you could plausibly think that pluralism is right, but that like we could be like, in other words, I don't think saying like some kind of pluralism is right is saying like, okay, stop trying to think of new kinds of moral considerations now, right? We're done, right? I think it could be I think it could maybe be saying you know,
Well, this is why we'll need like the culture AI brains in future to remember all the values we have to be puristic about.
yeah, there you go. So, um, but as a somewhat separate issue from the pluralism thing, the that I should say that, because I think you could think this next bit whether or not you're a pluralist, although it'll take different forms depending on whether you're a pluralist. That ultimately my interest in all this, right? It's like I have, look, as you say, people, not all of them, even Americans, right, spend way too much time thinking about like what the right approach to take is to American elections. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Tax ships on fire off the coast of Iran. Australians who obsessively tweet all day and all night about American politics. But so obviously part of why I did this. I mean, look, it's you have a bunch of figures I'm interested in for political reasons. Argue about the trolley problem. Obviously, that's something I'm going to take an interest in. But like also, like everybody else except for you, right? I've spent way too much time thinking about American elections. So obviously, I have views on this, and it's interesting to think philosophically about those views. But what I'm more interested in, and what the follow up next week is going to be, is this like larger question that this just kind of sets up, which is that you have, okay, forget elections for a second, right? I mean, just think about leftist politics in general. That I think thinking about stuff like Poole versus Seder on the trolley problem in elections and sort of overgeneralizing from that, I think some people, some leftists, particularly in my experience, very online leftists, often find themselves attracted to this combination of philosophical views that I'm very interested in pushing back against, which is that we should just be pure consequentialists about morality, that forget all that talk about rights and all that other stuff. That's like the only thing we should, only thing we should care about, right? Our only sort of notion of justice or anything else should be a consequentialist one. Should purely just be about maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering, etc. And then going along with that as the sort of you can have this first view without the second view, but the two pair in a very natural way. And it's like it's a common combination is this idea that leftist politics sort of go hand in hand with a rejection of any sort of notion of free will or robust moral responsibility. And, I think that the picture a lot of people have is like, look, they associate, they associate talk of like non-consequentialist rights talk with like defenses of capitalist property rights. They associate talk about free will and moral responsibility with harsh punitive approaches to criminal justice and or sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, victim blaming about poverty and inequality. And they rightly revile all of those things. And then I think they sort of wrongly associate these other positions with like scientific materialism. And when you put it all together, I think it ends up becoming sort of natural that a lot of leftists end up gravitating towards, what is ironically, people remember the essay I did about this about a month ago, exactly Sam Harris's combination of
Right,
of
and as I mentioned last week, it seems the view taken up by kind of the most psychotic of capitalists.
yeah, right. And I would actually argue that it's a much more natural fit with what they think than what we think on further investigation. But that's going to be next week.
Cool. Well, I'm going to find the outro and then I'm going to click on it.
All right.
Goodbye,
Well,
everyone.